Some people wear expensive suits to hide who they are. Others wear simple uniforms and reveal who they truly are. The words would not be spoken until much later, but on that warm Friday evening in downtown Chicago, fate had already begun proving them true. Crystal chandeliers spilled golden light across the polished marble floor of the Grand Harrison Hotel, where more than 300 executives, investors, and political figures gathered for one of the city's most anticipated annual leadership galas. Every polished shoe echoed confidence. Every tailored jacket whispered status. Waiters and waitresses moved quietly between clusters of wealthy guests like invisible shadows, trained to appear whenever needed and disappear the second their work was finished. Among them was Amara Collins. At 29, she carried a silver tray with calm hands and an even calmer expression, her neatly pressed black and white waitress uniform blending into the background exactly as management expected. Few people noticed the intelligence behind her warm brown eyes. Fewer still noticed the careful way she observed every conversation without ever seeming to listen. For Amara, this was simply another 12-hour shift, another evening of smiling politely, serving sparkling water, replacing empty glasses, and earning enough tips to help cover the mounting medical bills waiting at home. Her grandmother had always reminded her that dignity never depended on the clothes someone wore, only on the choices they made while wearing them. Across the ballroom stood Nathaniel Brooks, founder and CEO of Brooks Capital Group, one of the fastest-growing investment firms in the Midwest. At 48, Nathaniel had built a reputation almost as impressive as his fortune. Financial magazines praised his instincts. Television interviews celebrated his discipline. Employees admired his relentless standards, even if they quietly feared disappointing him. He believed success came from reading people within seconds. Their handshake, their posture, their clothes, their confidence. To Nathaniel, appearances rarely lied. That belief had helped him build an empire. Tonight, he was preparing to finalize the largest acquisition in his company's history, a partnership expected to generate billions in future investments. Around him stood attorneys, senior advisors, board members, and representatives from Ashcroft Global Holdings, all waiting for one final ceremonial signature before the official announcement. Crystal glasses clinked softly while cameras positioned themselves for the historic photograph. As Amara approached with a tray of freshly poured coffee, one of the executives reached for a cup too quickly, causing several confidential documents near Nathaniel's elbow to slide dangerously close to a small spill. Before anyone else reacted, Amara gently set down her tray and carefully lifted the stack of papers away from the moisture with practiced precision. "Sorry about that, sir," she said quietly. Nathaniel barely glanced at her before straightening his cufflinks. "Just stick to serving coffee," he replied with a faint smile that carried more dismissal than gratitude. "Leave business to the people wearing suits." Several guests chuckled politely. One board member smirked into his champagne glass. Another whispered something that made his companion laugh even harder. Amara simply nodded. "Yes, sir." She collected the empty cup without another word and stepped back into the rhythm of the room, her face composed despite every eye that had briefly measured her worth by the uniform she wore. Nathaniel turned back toward the polished leather folder waiting in front of him. The agreement was already open to the final signature page. Cameras edged closer. Pens were uncapped. Every executive leaned forward in anticipation. But as Amara passed behind the conference display one last time, something near the middle of the contract caught her attention. Her footsteps slowed almost imperceptibly. Her breathing became still. Hidden between two ordinary paragraphs was a single clause she recognized instantly. And in that silent heartbeat, she realized the celebrated CEO was only seconds away from making the biggest mistake of his career. Amara's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the silver tray as she continued walking, refusing to let even the smallest change in her expression reveal what her eyes had just discovered. Years earlier, she might have reacted differently. Years earlier, she would have spoken immediately, convinced that truth always found willing ears. Life had taught her otherwise. She reached the service station behind the ballroom, quietly placed the tray onto the stainless steel counter, and drew a slow breath. Around her, other servers exchanged quick smiles while polishing glasses and arranging dessert plates. None of them noticed that Amara's thoughts had drifted miles away from the elegant hotel. They had returned instead to a small brick house on Chicago's South Side, where her grandmother Amara Collins rested in a recliner beneath a handmade quilt, recovering from another difficult round of dialysis. Medical bills covered nearly every inch of the kitchen table these days. Prescription bottles seemed to multiply faster than paychecks. Every extra shift mattered. Every tip mattered. Losing this job was not an option. Yet the clause she had glimpsed only moments earlier refused to leave her mind. It wasn't simply unusual. It was dangerous. She had spent years reading contracts that looked exactly like that one. Hidden liability transfers disguised beneath ordinary legal language. Responsibility quietly shifted from one corporation to another until the wrong signature turned a profitable partnership into financial disaster. Most people would never recognize it. Most executives trusted their legal teams to catch such details. Amara knew better because she had once been the person everyone trusted to find them. Before life changed course, before hospitals replaced conference rooms and caregiving replaced corporate promotions, Amara Collins had worked as a senior risk analyst for one of New York's most respected financial consulting firms. Her reports had protected billion-dollar mergers. Her attention to detail had earned quiet respect from attorneys twice her age. Then her mother passed unexpectedly. Months later, Eleanor's health collapsed. Amara resigned without hesitation, moved back to Chicago, and promised herself family would come before career. She never regretted that decision, even when recruiters stopped calling after the long employment gap. Interviews became shorter. Smiles became more polite. Employers looked at her resume, then at the missing years, and somehow saw uncertainty instead of sacrifice. Eventually, the hotel offered steady work, medical insurance, and enough flexibility to accompany her grandmother to appointments. She accepted without complaint. A job was honorable regardless of the uniform. Across the ballroom, applause interrupted her thoughts. Nathaniel Brooks was thanking investors while photographers circled the stage. His confidence filled the room with the effortless certainty of a man who had rarely questioned his own judgment. Watching him now, Amara felt no resentment over his earlier remark. She had met people like him before, brilliant in many ways, but convinced success made first impressions infallible. She simply wished he understood that intelligence often arrived wearing ordinary clothes. One of the hotel supervisors approached carrying another tray. "Amara, can you refresh the coffee service near the executive table? They're signing in just a few minutes." She nodded automatically. Of course. As she lifted the fresh tray, her heartbeat quickened. She told herself to ignore the contract. It wasn't her responsibility. Speaking up could cost her employment. Remaining silent would keep her grandmother's treatments paid for another month. But every step toward the ballroom made that choice feel heavier. She could already picture tomorrow's headlines celebrating the historic acquisition, while knowing that buried beneath the celebration sat a mistake waiting to surface. When she returned to the executive table, Nathaniel had already uncapped his pen, and the signature page was directly in front of him, while the page containing the hidden clause remained only inches away, close enough for Amara to know with complete certainty that she still had one final chance to stop him. Nathaniel Brooks accepted the fountain pen from his legal counsel with the relaxed confidence of someone who had repeated this ritual dozens of times before. Around the long mahogany table, cameras adjusted their angles while investors straightened their jackets, eager to witness another headline-making victory. Across from him, representatives from Ashcroft Global Holdings exchanged composed smiles, their expressions polished enough to reveal nothing beyond quiet confidence. Nathaniel appreciated that. He believed the strongest negotiations ended without unnecessary emotion. His chief attorney, Michael Donovan, leaned slightly toward him and whispered, "Everything has been reviewed twice. We're clear to proceed." Nathaniel nodded once. Michael had worked beside him for nearly 12 years. There had never been a major mistake. Trust had become routine. Just beyond the table, Amara carefully refilled crystal water glasses one by one, moving with practiced precision while her thoughts raced faster than her steady hand suggested. The clause she had recognized refused to leave her mind because it followed a pattern she had investigated years before. The wording appeared harmless at first glance, wrapping unusual liability language inside routine compliance terminology. Experienced attorneys often focused on the broader transaction while assuming those supporting paragraphs were standard. That assumption was exactly how sophisticated financial traps succeeded. Amara had seen companies spend years recovering from mistakes hidden inside language that barely occupied half a page. She remembered a late night in Manhattan when her former supervisor had pushed a thick acquisition file across the conference table and said, "The dangerous contracts aren't the ones that scream. They're the ones that whisper." She had never forgotten those words. Tonight, the document in front of Nathaniel whispered exactly the same way. She looked toward the executives surrounding him. Some checked their phones. Others quietly discussed market forecasts. No one appeared concerned. Why would they be? Every person seated there carried impressive credentials, prestigious degrees, and expensive tailored suits. Every person except the woman standing quietly with a coffee pot. Nathaniel glanced briefly toward Amara as she approached to refill his cup. This time his attention lingered for only a second before returning to the contract. She remained, in his mind, another efficient hotel employee doing her assigned task. He admired professionalism and service staff, but he rarely considered that their lives extended beyond the roles they performed. The uniform settled the question before curiosity ever could. Amara poured the coffee slowly, buying herself another heartbeat to think. She could walk away and no one would ever know she had recognized the problem before anyone else. If disaster followed months later, responsibility would belong to lawyers, executives, auditors, and consultants earning salaries far beyond hers. She would simply remain a waitress who had served coffee during an unfortunate business deal. Yet another voice answered inside her, quieter but impossible to ignore. Her grandmother had repeated it since childhood. Character is what you do when staying silent costs less than telling the truth. Amara swallowed carefully. Around the ballroom, the orchestra transitioned into a softer melody while photographers raised their cameras again. Nathaniel uncapped his pen. Michael slid the signature page directly into position. One board member joked that by tomorrow morning the company's stock would probably climb another 5%. Laughter circled the table. No one noticed Amara's heartbeat quickening. She looked once more at the page containing the concealed clause and recognized a second detail she had missed earlier. The liability transfer would not activate immediately after the merger. It would quietly trigger 6 months later through an automatic compliance provision, making it appear as though Brooks Capital had accepted the risk voluntarily all along. In that instant, she realized this was no drafting oversight. Someone had built the deception deliberately, and Nathaniel's signature was now only inches away from making it legally irreversible. Amara felt the weight of the coffee pot in her hand, but it was nothing compared to the weight of the decision pressing against her conscience. The ballroom seemed to grow quieter even though conversations still floated through the air and glasses continued to clink beneath the chandeliers. Time had slowed. Nathaniel. Brooks rested the tip of his fountain pen against the signature line while flashes from photographers reflected across the polished conference table. One smooth motion was all that remained. One signature. One celebration. One irreversible mistake. Amara heard her grandmother's voice as clearly as if Eleanor were standing beside her. Doing the right thing is rarely convenient, sweetheart. That's why so few people choose it. She drew a careful breath and stepped forward before fear could convince her otherwise. "Excuse me, sir." The words were soft, but in the sudden stillness they carried farther than she expected. Nathaniel paused, the pen hovering just above the paper. Around the table, several executives turned toward the interruption with puzzled expressions. Michael Donovan frowned immediately. "Miss, we're in the middle of an official signing." Amara kept her posture respectful. "I'm sorry for interrupting, but I believe there's a serious problem in the contract." Silence settled across the ballroom. Someone near the back gave a quiet, uncertain laugh, assuming she must be joking. Nathaniel slowly looked up from the agreement and met her eyes for the first time that evening without immediately looking away. His expression showed more annoyance than curiosity. "A problem?" he asked evenly. "Yes, sir." She nodded. "There's a liability clause that appears routine, but it transfers long-term financial responsibility to Brooks Capital through a delayed compliance provision. If this agreement is signed as written, your company could become responsible for losses that were never intended to belong to you." A few guests exchanged amused glances. One investor folded his arms and smiled politely, as though watching an unexpected piece of entertainment before dessert. Michael let out a restrained sigh. "Miss, Our legal department has reviewed every page repeatedly. I'm sure they have, Amara answered calmly. But I don't think anyone traced the cross-reference attached to subsection 8. The language activates 6 months after closing instead of immediately. That's what hides the transfer. Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly. He leaned back in his chair and studied the waitress standing beside the table. Her voice contained neither panic nor arrogance. She sounded certain. That certainty irritated him more than the interruption itself. And how, he asked, would someone serving coffee know anything about merger agreements? The question hung in the air. A few quiet chuckles followed from guests who assumed the conversation had already reached its obvious conclusion. Amara did not react to the laughter. Because the wording follows a pattern I've seen before. Michael shook his head. Sir, with respect, we shouldn't delay a transaction of this size over speculation from someone who isn't part of the negotiation. Several board members nodded in agreement. Nathaniel glanced briefly at the cameras waiting only a few feet away. Hundreds of employees and investors expected confidence from him, not hesitation caused by an unexpected interruption from hotel staff. He looked back at Amara. I appreciate your concern, he said in a controlled voice, but this discussion is outside your responsibilities. Please return to your work. Amara remained where she stood. She knew another second of silence would likely end the opportunity forever. Sir, she said carefully, I'm not asking you to believe me because of who I am. I'm asking you to verify page 42 before you sign. If I'm wrong, I'll apologize and quietly leave. Nathaniel stared at her for a long moment. The room waited. Then, without another word, he reached for the contract, flipped directly to page 42, and for the first time that evening allowed his eyes to search for the clause she had described. Nathaniel's eyes moved slowly across page 42, following each line with the calm confidence of a man expecting to confirm that nothing was wrong. The room remained perfectly still. Cameras that had been waiting for the ceremonial signature were now pointed toward an unexpected silence instead. Michael Donovan leaned slightly closer, watching the CEO scan the page without concern. It's the standard compliance section, he said quietly. Exactly the version we've been discussing all week. Nathaniel gave a slight nod, but he did not turn the page. His eyes had stopped near the middle of the document, where a dense paragraph referred to a supplemental schedule attached later in the agreement. It looked ordinary enough, yet something about the cross-reference caused him to hesitate. Where? He asked without looking up. Amara answered immediately. 3 paragraphs below the heading. The second sentence references Schedule F through the compliance appendix. Follow that reference instead of stopping at the paragraph. Michael frowned. That's administrative language. It doesn't affect ownership. No, Amara replied respectfully. It affects liability. Nathaniel silently flipped several pages until he reached the appendix. The ballroom had become so quiet that the soft turning of paper echoed across the polished walls. A few executives exchanged uneasy glances. Others shifted in their chairs, uncertain why the signing had suddenly stalled. Nathaniel read another page, then another. His confident expression faded just enough for Michael to notice. Is something wrong? The attorney asked. Nathaniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he returned to the earlier page and traced the references again with the tip of his pen. Michael, he finally said, why is Schedule F connected to post-closing environmental claims? Michael leaned forward. It shouldn't be. He accepted the contract, reading quickly with the practiced speed of an experienced corporate attorney. At first his face remained composed. Then his brow tightened. That's unusual. Across the table, one representative from Ashcroft Global Holdings calmly adjusted his tie, but said nothing. Nathaniel noticed the movement. Explain it, he said. Michael continued reading. The wording transfers responsibility for any undisclosed historical compliance issues after the 6-month review period. Nathaniel narrowed his eyes. Meaning? Michael hesitated. Meaning Brooks Capital could become responsible for claims originating before the acquisition. Several board members straightened in their seats. One investor quietly lowered his champagne glass onto the table. The light atmosphere that had filled the ballroom only minutes earlier disappeared beneath. Growing uncertainty. Nathaniel looked toward the Ashcroft delegation. Was this discussed during negotiations? The lead representative answered smoothly. Everything is disclosed in the agreement your legal team approved. The statement was technically true, yet it somehow sounded rehearsed. Nathaniel turned back toward Michael. Did we approve this? Michael swallowed carefully. I don't remember this provision appearing in the previous draft. Amara remained silent. She had not stepped closer. She had not tried to prove herself right. She simply stood beside the coffee service with both hands folded in front of her, allowing the document to speak for itself. Nathaniel looked at her again, this time with curiosity replacing irritation. He could no longer dismiss her observation as coincidence. She had identified the exact section before anyone else. Still, pride resisted surrendering completely. Even if the wording is unusual, one board member said, trying to steady the room. Perhaps we're overreacting. Legal language is often complicated. Amara spoke only after Nathaniel gave a small nod, allowing her to continue. Complicated language isn't the problem, she said gently. Hidden timing is. The clause delays the transfer long enough that everyone assumes the integration was successful before the obligation appears. By then, reversing it would be almost impossible. Michael reopened the appendix and compared it with an earlier printed draft lying inside his briefcase. His breathing slowed as his eyes raced across both documents. After several long seconds, he looked up, visibly unsettled. Mr. Brooks, he said quietly, this isn't the same version we reviewed yesterday. The ballroom no longer felt like a place built for celebration. The music had faded into the background, conversations had dissolved into whispers, and every pair of eyes seemed fixed on the contract lying open beneath the chandelier light. Nathaniel Brooks slowly removed his reading glasses and placed them beside the leather folder without saying a word. The silence carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. Michael Donovan continued comparing the two versions page by page, carefully aligning each paragraph until there could be no doubt. The wording was inserted after the final review, he said quietly. The cross-reference wasn't altered. Only the appendix changed. Nathaniel rested both hands on the edge of the table. His heartbeat remained steady, but inside, certainty had begun to fracture. For years he had trusted his ability to judge people almost instantly. He trusted polished presentations, prestigious resumes, and familiar reputations. Yet the person who had protected his company tonight had entered the ballroom carrying coffee instead of legal credentials. He looked across the room toward Amara. She stood exactly where she had been asked to remain, neither triumphant nor defensive. She wasn't watching the executives. She was simply waiting, her expression calm, almost as though the outcome no longer belonged to her. One of the Ashcroft executives finally cleared his throat. Perhaps we should postpone the signing until everyone has another opportunity to review the paperwork. Nathaniel met the man's eyes. The suggestion sounded reasonable, but it arrived only after the problem had been exposed. There won't be a signing tonight, Nathaniel replied evenly. Not until I understand exactly how this happened. The photographers lowered their cameras. Several investors quietly stepped away from the table, sensing that history would not unfold the way they had expected. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, rain had begun falling across the Chicago skyline. Soft drops tracing slow paths down the glass as city lights blurred into shimmering reflections. The ballroom felt strangely smaller now, as though the storm outside had settled inside the room as well. Amara glanced briefly toward the rain before looking back at the conference table. She felt neither satisfaction nor relief. She only hoped she had spoken soon enough. If the contract had been signed 30 seconds earlier, the damage might have remained hidden for months before anyone understood what had happened. Her grandmother often said that the hardest victories were the quiet ones, the moments when no applause followed because disaster had simply been prevented. Instead of witnessed, Nathaniel rose from his chair and walked slowly toward the windows, keeping his back to the room for several moments. His reflection stared back at him through the rain-covered glass, but it felt unfamiliar. He replayed the evening in his mind. His own words echoed louder now than they had when he first spoke them. Leave business to the people wearing suits. The sentence no longer sounded confident. It sounded careless. He realized he had dismissed someone before allowing her a single opportunity to speak, not because she lacked knowledge, but because he assumed her uniform defined the limits of her experience. That realization unsettled him more deeply than the contract itself. Behind him, Michael approached carrying both versions of the agreement. Mr. Brooks, he said softly, there's something else. Nathaniel turned. Michael opened the earlier draft beside the revised copy and pointed toward a small block of revision metadata near the final pages. The changes were uploaded only this afternoon, he explained. Someone with authorized access replaced the appendix just hours before tonight's ceremony. Nathaniel's expression hardened, not with anger, but with focus. This was no clerical mistake. Someone had planned every detail with remarkable precision. His eyes shifted instinctively toward Amara once more. She had uncovered the hidden clause, but now an even larger question stood in front of everyone in the room. If the contract had been deliberately altered only hours before the signing, then somewhere among the trusted people gathered beneath those glittering chandeliers was the person who had expected no one to notice. Nathaniel accepted both versions of the agreement from Michael Donovan and compared the revision logs himself, his attention narrowing onto every timestamp, every digital approval, every unnoticed detail that had slipped through layers of expensive expertise. Around the ballroom, conversations had dissolved into uneasy murmurs. The celebration everyone expected had quietly transformed into an investigation no one had anticipated. The executives from Ashcroft Global Holdings maintained polite expressions, but the confidence they had displayed only minutes earlier had begun to fade beneath careful silence. Nathaniel finally closed the folders and looked directly at Michael. Freeze every document related to this transaction. No files leave this room until our internal security team reviews the revision history. Michael nodded immediately. I'll make the calls. Nathaniel then turned toward the Ashcroft representatives. I'm sure you'll understand why the signing is postponed. The lead negotiator forced a diplomatic smile. Of course, we welcome transparency. Yet the response sounded rehearsed, and Nathaniel noticed the subtle exchange of glances between two members of the opposing legal team before they quickly looked away. For the first time all evening, instinct told him something larger than a drafting error had unfolded in front of him. As the executives dispersed into smaller conversations, Nathaniel walked toward Amara with measured steps. The ballroom seemed almost suspended in time as people quietly watched the CEO approach the waitress he had dismissed less than an hour earlier. Amara remained composed, holding the now empty coffee pot against her side. She had no expectation of praise. She simply hoped the company had been spared a costly mistake. Nathaniel stopped a few feet away. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. He realized he had been evaluating people for most of his professional life. Yet he had completely failed to evaluate the person standing before him. You recognize that clause almost instantly, he said at last. Most experienced attorneys didn't. Amara answered with the same calm tone she had maintained throughout the evening. Some patterns stay with you once you've seen enough of them. Nathaniel studied her carefully. That wasn't luck. She gave a small shake of her head. No, sir. Who taught you to read contracts like that? She hesitated, not because she wanted to hide the truth, but because she had spent years learning not to define herself by a career she no longer had. I used to work in corporate risk analysis. Nathaniel's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Used to. Before my mother passed away, she replied. Softly. After that, my grandmother became ill. She needed someone at home, so I left my position and moved back to Chicago. Nathaniel listened without interrupting. There was no self-pity in her voice, only quiet honesty. What firm? He asked. Ellison Mercer Advisory in New York. Michael, who had just returned after speaking with the company's compliance director, stopped in his tracks when he heard the name. Ellison Mercer? He repeated. You work there? Amara nodded. Michael looked at Nathaniel. That's one of the top risk consulting firms in the country. Their senior analysts review some of the largest acquisitions on Wall Street. Nathaniel looked back at Amara, his earlier assumptions collapsing one after another. The uniform he had judged so quickly had hidden years of specialized experience. The waitress he believed belonged only behind a coffee tray possessed exactly the expertise that had protected his company when every prestigious title in the room had overlooked the danger. Before Nathaniel could respond, Michael's phone vibrated. He answered immediately, listened for several seconds, then looked up with unmistakable urgency. Our IT director just confirmed the login records, he said quietly. The revised appendix wasn't uploaded from Ashcroft's network. Nathaniel frowned. Then whose credentials were used? Michael lowered the phone slowly. Someone inside Brooks Capital authorized the final change. Nathaniel remained silent for several moments after Michael lowered the phone. The realization settled over him like the steady rain still falling beyond the ballroom windows. This had never been a simple oversight. Someone inside his own organization had manipulated the agreement, trusted that every review would focus on obvious numbers instead of carefully disguised legal language, and counted on the confidence of experienced executives to carry the document safely across the finish line. The only reason that plan had failed was because one woman wearing a waitress uniform had refused to ignore what her conscience recognized. Nathaniel slowly turned toward the gathered executives, investors, and board members who had witnessed every unexpected moment of the evening. Their expressions had changed completely. The quiet smiles that had followed his earlier dismissal of Amara had disappeared, replaced by thoughtful silence. He understood exactly what they had all seen, including himself. Without hesitation, Nathaniel stepped closer to Amara until they stood only a few feet apart. His voice remained calm, but every word carried unmistakable sincerity. "Miss Collins, I owe you an apology." The room became perfectly still again. Nathaniel continued without looking away. "Earlier tonight, I judged you before I knew anything about you. I looked at your uniform and assumed it represented the limits of your ability. I was wrong." Amara held his gaze with quiet grace. She had imagined many possible endings after speaking up, but she had never expected this one. Nathaniel drew a slow breath. "If you had stayed silent because of the way I treated you, Brooks Capital might have signed an agreement that would have harmed thousands of employees, investors, and families who depend on this company. Instead, you chose integrity over comfort." Amara answered gently. "I wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. I simply didn't want to watch a mistake happen when I knew I could prevent it." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "That's exactly what makes your decision extraordinary." Around them, several board members lowered their eyes, remembering the amused expressions they had worn only an hour earlier. Even Michael Donovan looked humbled by the evening's events. Nathaniel turned toward the room. "Tonight we've all been reminded of something far more important than any acquisition. Expertise doesn't always announce itself. Wisdom doesn't always wear a title. And character certainly doesn't depend on a suit." The words echoed softly across the ballroom. No one interrupted. Nathaniel then looked back at Amara. "Would you consider meeting with me after this investigation is complete? Not as hotel staff. As a professional." Amara smiled politely, though there was no trace of triumph in her expression. "I'd be willing to have a conversation." Before Nathaniel could reply, Michael approached again, carrying a tablet displaying preliminary security findings. "The internal audit team identified the account used to approve the revised appendix," he said quietly. "The credentials belong to our executive vice president of corporate development, but there's evidence someone else accessed the account remotely. Digital forensics has already preserved the records." Nathaniel looked at the screen, then closed the cover without reading further. "We'll let the investigators finish their work." He turned back toward Amara once more. "Whatever the final report says, one fact is already beyond question. You protected this company." Amara simply nodded. "I'm glad the truth was found before it was too late." Outside, the rain had begun to ease, and a faint glow from the city skyline reflected across the wet glass. Inside the ballroom, the contract remained unsigned. The celebration had quietly transformed into gratitude, and Nathaniel understood that the most valuable lesson of the evening had never been hidden inside the agreement at all. It had been standing beside him from the beginning, overlooked only because he had mistaken a uniform for the measure of a person's worth. At that very moment, Nathaniel made a private decision that would change not only Amara's future, but also the culture of the company he had spent decades building. The investigation concluded exactly 3 weeks later, and every major finding confirmed what Nathaniel Brooks had suspected on the night the signing ceremony came to an unexpected halt. A senior executive inside Brooks Capital had quietly allowed outside consultants temporary access to confidential files through a compromised account, believing the altered language would pass unnoticed during the final review. The hidden clause had been carefully designed to transfer millions of dollars in future liability while preserving the appearance of a fair agreement. The transaction was canceled before any signatures became legally binding. The authorities handling corporate compliance opened their own review, and Brooks Capital immediately strengthened every approval process within the company. Financial publications later described the incident as one of the closest corporate calls in recent memory, but the headlines never fully captured the quiet moment that had prevented the disaster. Those who attended the gala remembered something different. They remembered a waitress who noticed what an entire room of accomplished professionals had overlooked. A month after the investigation ended, Nathaniel invited Amara Collins to Brooks Capital headquarters, not through the hotel's management office, but through a formal letter addressed personally to her home. The meeting took place in the same executive boardroom where countless strategic decisions had shaped the company's future. This time there were no cameras, no reporters, and no investors waiting for announcements. Only Nathaniel, Michael Donovan, several board members, and an empty chair reserved for Amara. When she entered, she wore a simple navy business suit she had carefully pressed the night before. Nathaniel stood to greet her before anyone else could. "Welcome," he said with a genuine smile. "I'm glad you're here." During the meeting, Nathaniel offered her a position leading a newly established risk review and ethics advisory division, designed specifically to ensure every major decision received independent analysis before final approval. The salary would comfortably cover her grandmother's medical care, provide excellent benefits, and allow her to return to the profession she had quietly left behind years earlier. Amara listened carefully before answering. "I'd be honored to accept," she said, "but only if the department is encouraged to question every assumption, even yours." Nathaniel smiled wider than anyone in the room had ever seen during a business meeting. "Especially mine," he replied. That single sentence quietly reshaped the culture of Brooks Capital. Employees gradually discovered that thoughtful questions were no longer viewed as challenges to authority, but as acts of responsibility. Junior analysts felt comfortable raising concerns. Administrative assistants were invited into process improvement discussions. Receptionists, interns, maintenance workers, and support staff found their observations treated with unexpected respect. Nathaniel introduced a new leadership principle during every executive orientation. "Never confuse a person's role with their value," he would say. "Talent doesn't announce itself with a title. Character doesn't arrive wearing expensive clothes." Months later, Eleanor Collins sat comfortably beside her living room window, stronger than she had been in years, smiling as Amara prepared dinner after another fulfilling day at work. Framed on a nearby shelf rested a simple photograph taken during Amara's first week at Brooks Capital. She had insisted on keeping the old Waitress name tag inside a small memory box beneath the picture, not because she wanted to remember being underestimated, but because she never wanted to forget where humility and courage had met. One quiet evening after everyone else had left the office, Nathaniel paused outside the conference room where the unsigned contract had once rested beneath bright chandelier light. The room was empty now. The polished table reflected only the soft glow of the setting sun stretching across the Chicago skyline. He stood there for a long moment before turning off the lights and closing the door. He finally understood that the greatest mistake he almost made had never been signing the wrong agreement. It had been believing that a uniform could tell him the worth of the person wearing it. And in the silence that followed, with nothing left to prove and no applause left to hear, the lesson remained stronger than any business victory he would ever achieve. True strength is revealed not by status, wealth, or appearance, but by the courage to do what is right when no one expects your voice to matter.